Look at your hand right now. No, really look at it. Somewhere close to you tonight, in your palm or on your nightstand, is a small device that tells you the hour in neat little hours and minutes. 60 minutes make an hour. 360 degrees make a circle. You use these numbers so often, so automatically, that you've probably stopped noticing they're even there. But somebody had to invent them. And when I say somebody, I don't mean the Greeks. I don't mean the Romans. I don't mean the great pharaohs standing beside their pyramids. The image most of us were handed in school as where it all began. Almost everything you were taught about the birthplace of civilization is quietly, gently, almost completely wrong. Not because anyone lied to you on purpose, but because the true beginning happened so long ago, in a place so unfamiliar, that it simply never made it into the story most of us were told. The real beginning is older. Much older. And it happened somewhere most modern maps barely mention a narrow green strip of land between two rivers in what is now southern Iraq, where 5,000 years ago, in the warm mud and the rustle of reeds and the heat rising softly off slow-moving water, a small number of ordinary people quietly built the world you are lying in tonight. You can almost feel it if you let yourself the coolness of river clay pressed between fingers, the low murmur of water moving past reed banks, the first orange light catching the tops of mudbrick walls that haven't been built yet, the wheel, the city, the written word, the idea that a law could apply to everyone, not just the powerful, the hour on your clock, the number system hiding underneath your mathematics, the very notion that time itself could be measured and shared and agreed upon by strangers who would never meet. All of it, every single piece began here, cradled between two rivers called the Tigris and the Euphrates. Rivers most of us have never even heard named aloud. And wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here to hear them. If you're lying in a small apartment in Tokyo at 3:10 in the morning, hello. If you're in Sacramento, California, at 11 at night, staring at the ceiling after a long, heavy day, hello. If you're in Manchester, or in Melbourne, or parked at a quiet truck stop somewhere outside Kansas City, one earbud in so you don't wake anyone sleeping nearby, hello. I'm glad you found your way here. And if the only reason you're listening tonight is because you're hoping, quietly, to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these. So if you'd like, maybe tap subscribe whenever the moment feels right. And down in the comments, before your eyes close, tell me your city and your time. I love waking up to that map of the world, scattered with strangers who were, for one night, not alone. Tonight, we're going to travel back together slowly, gently, in no hurry at all across roughly 5,000 years. We'll begin in the very first villages, when a small group of people decided, quietly, that they didn't have to keep walking anymore. They could simply stay. We'll walk into Uruk, the world's first true city, and stand beneath a tower of sun-baked brick that reached higher than anything human hands had built before. We'll meet the young scribes bent over damp clay by the light of a single oil lamp, teaching our whole species how to remember, and through it all, we'll watch a single idea grow up. The idea that a story once written down could outlive the person who wrote it, could reach all the way across 5,000 years, into this dark, quiet room to reach you. We'll meet a man who began his life carrying water for someone else, and ended it ruling the first empire the world had ever seen. We'll sit beside a king named Hammurabi as he has 282 laws carved into black stone, so that even the powerful could not simply do as they pleased. And at the very end of our journey tonight, we'll stand quietly outside the walls of Babylon on the night the age of clay tablets gently closed, and the very last scribe on earth wrote his final line. None of this is something you need to remember. If your eyes are already growing heavy, let them close. If you drift off somewhere near Uruk and wake up, hours from now, near Babylon, don't worry, the rivers will still be there. So will I. So settle in now. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher if you'd like. Let your shoulders drop, just a little, away from your ears. We're going to travel a long way tonight. through cities older than any history book you were ever handed, through inventions so familiar you'd stop truly seeing them, and through the quiet, patient people who first imagined them into being. By the time we're done, the clock beside your bed may look just a little different to you. So might the words forming in your mind right now. So might the walls of whatever city you call home. Because here's the thing, you are still living in their world. You just quietly forgot. And to understand any of it, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a handful of small villages beside two quiet rivers, long before anyone had a name for what a city even was. Long before anyone called this stretch of earth Mesopotamia a name the Greeks would give it, centuries later, meaning simply the land between the rivers. It was just mud and reeds, and two rivers that never quite agreed with each other about how to behave. The Tigris ran fast and reckless, prone to sudden violent floods that could erase a season's planting in a single night. The Euphrates moved slower, calmer, more forgiving, wide and lazy, easy to predict, easy to live beside. It is no accident that almost every one of the earliest villages we know of chose to settle along the Euphrates first. People, it turns out, have always preferred rivers they can trust. The Sumerians, when they finally gave these two rivers proper names, called the Euphrates Buranun and the Tigris Idigna, the Swift River, a name that still tells you exactly which one to trust less. To them, the rivers were not just water. They were characters living, moody, occasionally furious presences that had to be respected, appeased, and worked with rather than against. Every spring, when the snow high up in the distant mountains of what is now Turkey began to melt, both rivers would swell and spread, carrying with them a fine, dark silt, the accumulated richness of an entire mountain range, delivered for free, right to the doorstep of anyone patient enough to wait for it. It must have felt, to the people living through it, almost like a kind of mercy, destruction and gift, arriving together every single year on a schedule the rivers alone understood. If you have ever lain awake near an open window during a spring storm, listening to rain finally break a long dry spell, you already know something of what it might have felt like to hear that first surge of floodwater moving past a village at night, the relief of it, and the danger of it, folded together into the very same sound. Picture it, if you can, without the weight of everything that came after. No cities yet, no writing, no kings, no temples taller than a house, just small clusters of reed and mud huts, no bigger than a modern neighborhood block, scattered along the riverbank wherever the soil looked dark and rich enough to hold a seed. Long before this, other patient hands had already tried something like it. In a place called Jericho, tucked into what is now the West Bank, a low stone tower and thick round walls were rising more than 9,000 years ago, and far to the north, on the plains of what we now call Turkey, a village called Uruk packed its houses so tightly together that people entered them not through doors, but by ladders down through openings cut into the roofs. Both were older, in fact, than anything yet standing along these two rivers' quiet, stubborn experiments in staying still. But it was here, in this narrow green strip between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that the experiment would take root and slowly grow into something the world had never seen. The people who lived here, we call them, today, the Ubaid people, after a low mound in southern Iraq, where their pottery was first uncovered by archaeologists digging in the sand, had already made one of the strangest decisions in the entire history of our species. They had chosen to stop moving. For nearly the whole of human existence before this moment, home had been wherever the herd was, wherever the season's fruit was ripening, wherever the last rain had fallen. To settle in one place to build a wall that expected to still be standing next spring was, in a very real sense, an act of faith. Faith that the river would flood on schedule, faith that the barley would grow again, faith that the neighbours, sharing your one narrow strip of fertile mud, would not turn on you before the harvest came in. And so the first true villages of the two rivers were not, at their heart, about clever architecture or defensive walls. They were about trust. 100 small acts of trust, repeated every single season by people who had every reason, based on everything their ancestors had ever known, to keep walking instead. If you listen closely enough to the quiet of an early Ubaid village at night, you might have heard almost nothing at all. No traffic, no machinery, none of the low electric hum that fills your own home right now without you even noticing. Just water moving past reed banks, the occasional bleat of a tethered goat. Somewhere, softly, the scrape of a reed mat being shifted for sleep. But underneath that quiet, something enormous was already happening. To live beside a river that flooded every year was to face a very particular kind of problem. A problem no single family could solve alone. The Euphrates gave generously, but only if its water could be coaxed, gently, away from the riverbank and into the fields that actually needed it. That meant digging canals, and digging a canal long enough to matter meant more hands than any one household possessed. So people who had never needed each other quite this way before started needing each other. A canal serving 6 families required 6 families to agree on where to dig, on who would maintain which stretch, on how the water, once it arrived, would be shared out fairly between them. It required, in other words, something we rarely think of as an invention at all: cooperation, formalized, repeated, and passed down. Out of that quiet cooperation came the very first stirrings of something you'd recognize today as a shared public space. Not a government, not yet even a village council, in any way we'd name it now, but a low mound of mud brick, usually near the center of the settlement, where offerings of grain and dates and small clay figurines were left a modest, unglamorous ancestor of the temples that would one day rise higher than anything human hands had built before. The Sumerians themselves, when they eventually began writing their own history down, remembered this part differently, more like a myth than a memory. They told the story of a city called Eridu, which they believed to be the very first city on Earth, a gift lowered gently down from heaven, where kingship itself was said to have first touched the ground. Whether or not it happened quite like that, Eridu really was here, really was old, older than almost anywhere else along these rivers, a low, unassuming mound today, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at, sitting quietly under the same relentless sun. At Eridu, the people worshipped a god named Enki, a strange, gentle god by the standards of most ancient mythologies, associated not with thunder or war, but with fresh water itself, and, oddly enough, with wisdom, and with cunning, and with the small clever tricks that let ordinary people survive extraordinary circumstances. It tells you something about what these first river people valued most. Not conquest, not domination, but water, and cleverness, and the quiet accumulation of things that worked. It is a strange comfort, honestly, to think that the very first city human beings ever imagined into existence was imagined not as a fortress, but as a gift, something lowered gently, rather than seized. Whatever this place actually was 5,000 years ago, the story people told about it tells you plenty about what they hoped a city could be. A typical day in one of these villages would have looked, to our eyes, almost impossibly slow. Mornings began early. Before the heat became unbearable, someone leading goats out along the riverbank. Someone else already crouched beside a reed mat, weaving. Grain was ground by hand, patiently, between 2 flat stones, a task that could take the better part of an hour, just to prepare a single day's bread. Fish were caught in woven reed traps set along quiet inlets. Dates were harvested from palms that had probably been planted by a grandparent, or a great-grandparent, long before anyone living could quite remember why. Nothing here moved quickly. Everything here moved on the river's schedule, and the suns and the seasons patient, cyclical, endlessly repeating, and somehow, despite that repetition, never quite the same twice. Slowly, so slowly, that no single person living through it could have possibly noticed, these villages began to change shape. Houses that had once stood alone began pressing closer together. Storage rooms grew larger. because a good harvest, carefully saved, could carry a family through a bad one. Pottery, once simple and rough, became finer, more decorated, painted in the soft geometric patterns that we still dig out of the ground today, thousands of years later, remarkably intact. And somewhere in all of that slow, patient accumulation, more grain than one family could eat, more pottery than one household could use, more hands available than any single farm required, something else began to accumulate too. Difference. Some families, for reasons of luck or skill or simply better land, ended up with more, and where there is more, there eventually needs to be someone keeping track of whose more is whose. It's worth noticing too what these first villages did not yet have. No walls built for war. The earliest settlements along the rivers show little evidence of large-scale conflict, at least not yet. No standing armies. No single absolute ruler whose word overruled everyone else's. For a few centuries at least, these were remarkably egalitarian little worlds, built more on cooperation than command, more on shared risk than shared fear. That would not last forever, but it lasted long enough to lay down the habits irrigation, storage, record-keeping, communal ritual that the cities to come would inherit and build upon, and eventually complicate almost beyond recognition. Up and down the riverbanks, similar villages were taking shape at almost the same slow pace, places that would one day carry names like Ur and Nippur and Lagash, each with its own patron god, its own local pride, its own small temple mound rising just slightly above the flat, green fields around it. None of them yet imagined themselves as rivals. None of them yet imagined themselves as anything more than what they were. Small, stubborn pockets of people who had decided, against every instinct passed down from 100,000 years of walking, to simply stay. That single unglamorous problem, who owns what, who gave what, who is owed what in return, would turn out to be one of the most powerful forces in the entire story we're telling tonight. It would push these villages toward organization. It would push organization toward leadership, and leadership, given enough centuries and enough grain stored in enough temple courtyards, would eventually push one particular village, sitting a little further downstream than most, toward becoming something the world had never quite seen before. That village was called Uruk, and understanding what happened there means understanding how a handful of villages became, for the first time in human history, a city. By the time Uruk had grown into what we would call a true city, sometime around 5,200 years ago, it had already outgrown every human settlement that had ever existed on the planet before it. Not the largest by the standards you might use today, but for the era, staggeringly, almost unbelievably large. Home, by some estimates, to as many as 50,000 people, all living inside a single settlement, packed together in mudbrick houses along narrow, winding streets that had never been planned by anyone, but had simply grown, alley by alley, the way a city always does when nobody stops to ask permission first. Try for a moment to imagine standing at the edge of it, arriving on foot after days of walking through empty, flat countryside, and suddenly finding yourself in front of a wall of mudbrick houses stretching further than you could see in either direction, smoke rising from 1,000 small ovens, voices layered over other voices, the smell of livestock and river mud and baking bread all tangled together in the same warm air. If you had grown up in one of the small scattered villages we just described with maybe 200 or 300 neighbours, all of whom you'd known your entire life, Uruk would not have looked like a bigger version of home. It would have looked like something from an entirely different world. At the heart of it all stood a temple complex the Sumerians called the Iana, the House of Heaven, dedicated to a goddess named Iana, who held in the minds of the people who worshipped her an almost dizzying number of roles at once: goddess of love, and of war, and of the morning and evening star, and, perhaps most importantly for a city built on trade and grain, goddess of abundance itself. Her temple wasn't simply a place of worship in the quiet, private way we might imagine a place of worship today. It was the city's bank, its warehouse, its administrative center, and its spiritual heart, all pressed into the very same walls. Rising above the flat mud brick rooftops, on a raised platform built and rebuilt over generations, stood what modern archaeologists now call the White Temple. An early ziggurat, though not yet the towering, tiered pyramid shape those later became famous for. Even in this earlier, simpler form, it must have dominated the skyline of Uruk the way nothing else could. Whitewashed walls catching the sun, visible, they say, from a full day's walk away across the flat river plain. For a person who had never before seen a structure taller than a single-story mud brick house, the White Temple would have seemed less like architecture and more like a mountain that had somehow, impossibly, been built by human hands. Because a city this size could no longer run on trust and memory alone. 6 families sharing one small canal could still work things out by talking, by remembering who owed what, by the simple, quiet accountability of people who saw each other every single day. 40,000 people could not. The temple, sitting at the center of a vast, complicated web of grain deliveries, wool shipments, beer rations, and labor obligations, needed a way to keep track of all of it that didn't depend on any one person's memory. And so, quietly, almost accidentally, administrators in Uruk began pressing small clay tokens into soft, wet tablets, a jar shape for oil, an ear shape for barley, simple pictures standing in for the things they represented. At first, it was barely more than a tally system, a way to remember how many sheep had entered the temple courtyard, how many jars of beer had left it. But tallies, kept carefully enough, for long enough, by enough different hands, have a way of slowly turning into something else entirely. Within a few centuries, those simple pictures would evolve into wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a cut reed, the beginning of what we now call cuneiform, the very first writing system our species ever produced. We are not there yet, tonight. That story, the story of the young scribes, bent over damp clay by lamplight, learning to turn sound into permanent shape, belongs to a night still ahead of us. For now, simply notice the seed of it, quietly forming in the record-keeping of an ordinary overcrowded temple courtyard, centuries before anyone understood what they were really building toward. Governing a city this size required something villages never needed: professional administrators. Not kings only, but overseers, scribes in training pressing their first clumsy marks into clay, temple stewards keeping account of grain owed and grain paid. Uruk did not invent bureaucracy out of ambition. It stumbled into it, the way a small stream turns into a river, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of every tributary it happens to cross. Uruk was also, according to later Sumerian legend, the city of a king named Gilgamesh, part historical figure, part myth, by the time his story was finally written down. The Sumerians remembered him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a king so restless, so unwilling to accept the ordinary limits of a human life, that he set out on a desperate, doomed search for immortality itself, only to return home, in the end, with something smaller and in its own way, larger. The understanding that a city built well enough, a wall raised strong enough, a story told clearly enough, could outlive the person who built it. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, here in the dark, in whatever room you're lying in tonight. Gilgamesh's search for forever ended not in eternal life, but in Uruk itself, its walls, its temple, its irrigated fields, all of it a kind of immortality that ordinary mortals, working together, patiently, over generations, had already managed to invent, long before he ever went looking for it. Later legend would credit Gilgamesh himself with building the great walls that eventually surrounded Uruk walls, stretching, by some ancient accounts, nearly 6 miles around, tall enough and thick enough that later travelers, centuries afterward, still spoke of them with something close to disbelief. Whether or not one king built them alone, walls of that scale could only have come from exactly the same force that dug the first canals generations earlier, Thousands of ordinary hands working together, season after season, for a reason most of them would never live to fully see completed. Life inside the city, for the ordinary people who were not kings or priestesses, moved to its own rhythm. Potters worked in small, smoky workshops near the city's edge, producing thousands of identical mass-made bowls, the world's first true evidence of standardized, assembly line production, thousands of years before anyone would think to name it that. Weavers turned river-fed wool into the cloth that clothed the entire city. Farmers out beyond the walls worked fields fed by canals that now stretched for miles, engineered and maintained by a labor force organized, quite literally, by the temple itself. And in the crowded streets between all of it, a market grew noisy, chaotic, full of bartering voices, the very first stirrings of what you might, without too much of a stretch, call an economy. Trade routes, by now, stretched further than anyone in the earliest riverside villages could have imagined obsidian from the mountains of Anatolia. Lapis lazuli carried overland, all the way from what is now Afghanistan. Copper from the Gulf. Uruk did not just grow food, it grew appetite for goods, for stories, for reasons to keep expanding outward, one trade caravan and one clay tablet at a time. At night, and this is the image I want to leave you with, as we let this section settle, Uruk would have gone quiet in its own particular way, not silent, the way the small villages by the river once were, but hushed. Lamps flickering out one by one along mud-brick rooftops, the temple's white walls catching whatever moonlight made it through the haze of cooking smoke still drifting up from 1,000 small ovens. And somewhere inside those walls, in a small unremarkable room, a person pressing careful marks into a soft clay tablet, keeping a record that though they could not possibly have known it would still be legible, still be readable, 5,000 years later, to someone lying in the dark, listening to a stranger's voice describe it, on the other side of the world. But a city that size, and a temple keeping track of that much grain, could not run forever on pictures alone. Somewhere inside those mud-brick walls, someone was about to have an idea that would outlast every king, every temple, and every wall Uruk would ever build an idea about how to make a mark that could speak, long after the person who made it had gone silent. Back in Uruk, in that quiet room we left just now, someone was still pressing marks into wet clay, but something had begun to shift in what those marks meant. At first, the marks were purely practical, a jar shape for a jar of oil, a sheaf shape for a bundle of barley, drawn quickly, roughly, by someone who cared only about counting, not about art. For a long while that was enough. A picture of a sheep meant a sheep, a picture of a jar meant a jar. Anyone could look at the tally and understand roughly what had been counted, even without being told a single word out loud. But grain, and sheep, and jars of oil were never really the hard part. The hard part was everything else. The debts that couldn't be drawn as a picture, the promises, the names of the people who owed and the people who were owed. You cannot draw a picture of tomorrow. You cannot draw a picture of I promise. And so, sometime in the centuries after Uruk's temple accountants first began pressing tally marks into clay, someone we will never know their name, and they could not have possibly guessed we would still be talking about them, 5,000 years later had a small, strange idea. What if a mark didn't have to represent a thing at all? What if it could represent a sound? Here's the thing. That single idea sound, not thing, is the hinge on which almost everything that followed would turn. Picture this. You are sitting cross-legged on a woven reed mat in a small mud-brick room at the edge of Uruk's temple courtyard. Sometime after the sun has gone down and the noise of the marketplace has finally settled into silence. A single oil lamp flickers nearby, and the room smells of scorched sesame oil, and beneath it, faintly, the cool, mineral smell of wet clay itself, almost like the riverbank at dawn, carried indoors. A slab of damp river clay rests in the palm of your hand. A cut reed stylus balances in the other. The only sound is the soft rhythmic scrape of the reed's cut edge pressing into clay, over and over, wedge after wedge, and somewhere outside, very faintly, a dog barking at nothing in particular. Your fingers are stained the pale grey-brown of dried clay dust. Your shoulders ache from sitting still this long, and beside you, close enough that you can feel the warmth of another person nearby, your teacher, a scribe who has done this every night for as long as anyone can remember, leans over your shoulder and says only, "Again, you will sit like this again tomorrow night, and the night after that, learning to press the same handful of signs into clay until your hand no longer hesitates before it moves." Scribal training like this could take the better part of a decade before it was finished long enough that some of the very first tablets a student ever pressed still survive today, 5,000 years later. Nothing more than clumsy practice lines. The same sign copied over and over down the page, a teacher's firmer correction pressed in at the bottom. Here's the thing about that. Before this, every single piece of knowledge any human being ever possessed lived only as long as somebody remembered to say it out loud. A story lasted exactly as long as someone chose to keep telling it. A debt lasted exactly as long as both people involved agreed to remember it the same way. The moment the last person who knew something died without passing it on, that knowledge simply quietly ceased to exist. Writing changed that. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with any fanfare at all. A handful of tired scribes pressing marks into clay by lamplight is about as undramatic an invention as history has ever produced. But for the first time, a thought could survive the person who thought it. A promise could outlive the voice that made it. A story could wait, patiently, in a clay tablet stacked in a dark storeroom, for a reader who hadn't even been born yet. You are, in fact, one of those readers right now. Somewhere in that unbroken chain of scribes and students and clay tablets and careful, patient repetition, the idea survived long enough to reach the language forming in your mind. This very moment, the quiet, involuntary voice reading these words to yourself, even in the dark, even with your eyes closed. That voice, whatever language it speaks in, is the greatest great-grandchild of a wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay by a tired apprentice 5,000 years ago, who never once imagined anyone this far away would ever be listening. Not every scribe who ever lived stayed in the temple courtyards of Uruk. As cities multiplied along the two rivers, and trade routes stretched further outward carrying wool and grain, and eventually far more complicated agreements than a simple jar of oil, the profession of scribe became something close to prestigious. A person who could read and write in a mostly illiterate world held a particular kind of quiet power, the power to record a debt accurately, to witness a contract fairly, to make sure that what was agreed out loud in one moment could still be proven true years later. Scribes began sealing their tablets with small carved cylinder seals, rolled across the wet clay to leave a unique personal mark, an early cousin of the signature you might still use today on a document of your own. And once clay could hold more than accounts, it began, slowly, to hold something closer to art. Hymns to Inanna, laments for fallen cities. Eventually, centuries later, the long, strange, beautiful story of Gilgamesh himself, the restless king of Uruk we met only a little while ago, his search for immortality, finally written down, word for word, so that even though he never found the eternal life he was looking for, his story did. That, more than any wall or ziggurat, may be the truest kind of permanence this whole civilization ever managed to invent. It took time, real time, generations of it before those wedge-shaped marks could capture more than temple accounts. Poetry came later, letters between kings came later, law came later still. But once a mark could hold a sound instead of just a thing, there was, in principle, nothing a person couldn't eventually learn to write down. Wishes, complaints, contracts, rules for how people ought to treat each other. And once you can write a rule down, once it no longer depends on any single ruler's memory, or mood, or mercy, You have accidentally invented something almost as significant as writing itself, the idea that a law could exist independently of the person enforcing it, that a rule, once carved or pressed or written, might outlast the king who made it and apply, in theory, to the next king too. That idea was still a long way from finished. It would take empires and lawgivers and more than one collapse before anyone dared to press an entire code of laws into stone for every citizen to see. But the seed of it, the strange, quiet possibility that a rule might belong to the clay and not to the man, was planted here, in this small lamplit room, by someone who almost certainly thought they were just doing paperwork. Writing was never the only kind of counting quietly taking shape in these temple courtyards. Somewhere in that same lamplit patience, another invention was forming, one that would decide, of all things, how you measure the hours of this very night. While the scribes of Uruk were teaching clay to hold sound, another kind of counting was quietly taking shape beside them, one that would end up living, of all places, on the device sitting on your nightstand right now. Here's the thing about counting. Most of us, without ever really choosing to, count in groups of 10. 10 fingers, 10 toes. It's not exactly a mystery why, but the people of the two rivers, for reasons we still argue about today, built their entire number system around a very different number, 60. 60 seems, at first, like an oddly clumsy choice, but sit with it for a moment, the way a Sumerian accountant sitting cross-legged in a temple storeroom might have sat with it, and something clicks into place. 60 can be divided evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30 more ways than almost any smaller number you could choose. For someone dividing a harvest of grain among an uneven number of families, or splitting a shipment of wool among workers who each did a different amount of work, that kind of flexibility wasn't a curiosity. It was, quite simply, useful. So the accountants of Sumer built their mathematics on a base of 60, the way you build yours on a base of 10, and they used it for almost everything: grain, land, silver, and eventually, the sky itself. Because somewhere in that same slow accumulation of careful, patient observation, priests and scribes began watching the sky the way they watched their fields, recording, tracking, noticing patterns repeat. And when it came time to divide something that had no natural divisions at all, a full circle, a full turn, the sweep of a horizon from one edge to the other 60 was already sitting there, waiting, endlessly divisible. They split the circle into 6 sections of 60, giving us 360 degrees. They split the day and the night, eventually, along a similar logic, hours divided into 60 minutes, minutes divided into 60 seconds. Here's the thing, that number 60, dividing your hours into minutes, your minutes into seconds, your circle into degrees, is still, right now, quietly running your life. Every time you glance at a clock in the dark, wondering how many hours are left before you have to be somewhere, you are reading a system invented by grain accountants beside a river in southern Iraq 5,000 years ago, who were only ever trying to divide a harvest fairly. We'll come back to that clock. We're not quite done with it yet. It wasn't only the sky and the harvest that these early mathematicians turned their attention to. Somewhere in the temple storerooms of Sumer, scribes were also solving what we would now call algebra, working out how to calculate the area of a field, how to compare the value of different weights of silver, how to divide an inheritance fairly among several children without any one of them feeling shortchanged. None of this looked like the neat equations you might remember, faintly, from a school classroom. It looked like word problems, written in cuneiform, patiently worked through step by step on clay tablets that some unlucky student left baking in the sun, and that we are, remarkably, still able to read today. Consider for a moment just how precise this counting eventually became. Scribes in Sumer, and later, in Babylon, worked out multiplication tables, tables of reciprocals, even methods for approximating square roots, mathematics sturdy enough that later Babylonian astronomers would use the very same base 60 system to track the movements of the planets with an accuracy that, when modern historians finally decoded it, was startling. Precision, it turns out, was never a modern invention. It was simply waiting, quietly, in clay, for someone patient enough to keep the records long enough to notice the patterns repeating. And it is worth pausing on that, gently, for a moment. Somewhere in a Sumerian classroom, a tired student worked through a math problem about dividing a field, got it slightly wrong, and their teacher corrected it in the margin, and that small, ordinary moment of frustration and correction survived every empire, every flood, every collapse that came after it, all the way to right now, to this room, to you. Here's the thing. Though mathematics on clay tablets is not the achievement most people would guess belongs to Sumer, ask almost anyone what the ancient world invented first, and most people will say Egypt, or Greece, or reach for some vague idea of the ancients without a face or a river attached to it at all. It is almost never Sumer, and it is almost never 60, and yet here you are, 5,000 years later, planning your entire day around it. Numbers were only half of what these accountants and priests were quietly building. Not far from the temple storerooms of Uruk, potters had been experimenting for generations with something almost as consequential: a flat, spinning disc, first used simply to shape wet clay evenly as it turned beneath a potter's careful hands. For a long while, that's all it was, a tool for pottery, nothing more. Spinning slowly under a craftsman's palms in a small workshop somewhere near the riverbank. The oldest wheel we have ever found wasn't attached to a cart at all, it was a potter's wheel, unearthed from a Sumerian city, worn smooth from years of steady, patient spinning under some anonymous craftsperson's palms. You can almost picture it, the low hum of the wheel turning, the cool give of wet clay beneath practiced fingers, a pot rising slowly out of formlessness, one careful rotation at a time. It would be centuries still before anyone thought to tip that same simple idea onto its side and let it carry a cart instead of a bowl. But somewhere around the same era that writing was taking its first true steps, someone looked at that spinning disc and asked a different question. What if this didn't just turn in place? What if it could carry something forward? Once it did, the change moved quickly. Ox-drawn carts began appearing in temple records, listed alongside grain and wool as property worth tracking. Roads little more than packed dirt at first began connecting villages that had once measured distance only in days of walking. A trip that had taken a person an entire exhausting day on foot, carrying everything on their own back, could now be covered by an ox and a cart in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the human exhaustion. Distance itself quietly began to shrink. Here's the thing about the wheel and the number 60, sitting side by side in this same stretch of river mud 5,000 years ago. Neither one looked, at the time, like the beginning of anything enormous. One was a way to divide a harvest fairly, the other was a way to shape a pot evenly, and yet you are, tonight, living inside the accumulated result of both measuring your hours in the same 60-base system, moving through your world on wheels, however many quiet steps removed from that first spinning potter's disc. It would be tempting, at this point, to imagine the story simply straightens out from here, invention after invention, steadily accumulating, no setbacks, no confusion, no arguments about who deserves credit. That would be a comforting story. It would also, like the idea that civilization began somewhere else entirely, be almost completely wrong. The two rivers were about to enter one of their most turbulent stretches, yet a time of ambition and unification, and a man who began his life doing something nobody would have predicted would end in an empire. Centuries passed. The small independent cities of the two rivers kept trading, kept counting, kept measuring their days in 60s until, one by one, they found themselves answering to a single throne for the very first time. Somewhere north of Uruk, along a stretch of the Euphrates, where the river bent gently toward what is now central Iraq, a man was about to do something no one in the two rivers had ever quite managed before. His name, at least the name history remembers him by, was Sargon, though that itself was likely a title he gave himself later, meaning something close to true king, the kind of name a person chooses only after they've already decided who they intend to become. Here's the thing about Sargon that later scribes love to repeat, and that we still don't know entirely whether to believe. According to the story that circulated for centuries after his death, he was not born to rule anything at all. The legend claims he began his life as an infant set adrift on the river in a basket of reeds, rescued and raised by a humble gardener, and that his first job, the very first thing anyone remembers him doing, was carrying water for someone far more powerful than himself, the king of a city called Kish. They didn't know, watching a young man haul water buckets across a palace courtyard, that they were watching the person who would go on to build the first true empire the world had ever seen. It is exactly the kind of story that later generations love to tell about the people who rise the furthest humble beginnings, hidden greatness, a twist nobody saw coming. Whether every detail happened exactly this way, historians still debate, but something in it clearly mattered enough to the people of Akkad that they kept telling it, generation after generation, long after Sargon himself was gone. What we do know, with far more confidence, is what came after the water buckets. Sargon built a new city, Akkad, in a location so precisely chosen and so completely built up around his own ambitions that we have never been entirely certain, even today, exactly where it stood buried somewhere beneath the shifting soil of what is now central Iraq, still waiting perhaps to be found. And from that new city he did something genuinely unprecedented. He brought city after independent city Uruk among them, along with Ur and Lagash and Kish itself, the very city he had once carried water for under a single ruler, for the first time in recorded history. Before Sargon, the two rivers had always been a patchwork, dozens of independent cities, each with its own king, its own patron god, its own local pride, occasionally allied, occasionally at odds, but never united. Sargon changed that arrangement, city by city, until an area covering hundreds of miles answered, for the first time, to a single throne. Here's the thing about ruling that much territory, that many different peoples, speaking different dialects and worshipping different local gods, all at once. It required something genuinely new, administrators who could travel between cities and be trusted in all of them, a shared language of record keeping that worked the same way whether you were in Akkad or Ur, and this part mattered enormously, a willingness to let local customs continue, largely undisturbed, underneath a single unifying authority. Holding that many cities together took more than ambition. Sargon's officials introduced standardized weights and measures across the entire territory. The same measure of grain, the same measure of silver, whether you were trading in Akkad or in a small river town 200 miles away. He appointed loyal administrators, often his own countrymen, to govern conquered cities rather than leaving power entirely in the hands of local rulers who might, given the chance, simply rebel. And the Akkadian language itself, a Semitic tongue quite different from the Sumerian spoken in the older southern cities, began spreading alongside his authority, until for the first time, two very different languages were being read and written, side by side, on the very same clay tablets. None of this came without turbulence. Later inscriptions, boastful in the way royal inscriptions always tend to be, describe city after city rising up against Akkad's rule, forcing Sargon to return again and again to reassert his authority over territory he had already once claimed. The picture that emerges, underneath all the official confidence, is of an empire held together as much by constant, exhausting effort as by any lasting sense of unity, a structure that worked, remarkably, for as long as someone determined enough kept actively holding it together. His grandson, a king named Naram-Sin, would take that ambition somewhere Sargon himself never quite dared to go. Where Sargon called himself true king, Naram-Sin had himself declared something far larger, a living god, worthy of his own temple, his own worship, while he was still alive to see it happen. Statues from his reign show him wearing the horned crown that, before him, had belonged only to gods, a detail so unusual, so pointedly deliberate, that it tells you almost everything about the scale of confidence, or perhaps the scale of anxiety driving it. By Naram-Sin's reign, the palace at Akkad must have felt, on an ordinary evening, like the very centre of the world courtyards lit by oil lamps, officials from a dozen different cities murmuring in at least 2 different languages, incense drifting from some inner chamber, a horned crown resting on a living man's head. Almost no one standing in that courtyard that evening could have guessed how completely that certainty was about to be tested. There is something quietly human, if you sit with it for a moment, about a ruler needing to declare himself divine. It suggests, more than anything, a person keenly aware of just how fragile even the grandest human achievement really is. An empire built by one determined water carrier's grandson trying, in the most permanent way he could imagine, to make sure it couldn't simply be undone. It could be undone. Almost everything eventually is. But we are not quite at that part of the story yet tonight, that particular unravelling, and the quiet, patient rebuilding that followed it belongs to what comes next. For now, simply notice this. An empire the very first the 2 rivers, or perhaps the world had ever seen, had risen from a single ambitious man who once carried water for someone else's throne. And empires, once they exist, always eventually raise the same quiet question underneath all their grandeur. How long can any of this possibly last? But how does an empire this new come apart? Faster, it turns out, than anyone inside it expects. Naram-Sin's horned crown did not, in the end, answer the question his own empire had quietly been asking since the day Sargon first carried water for someone else's throne. How long can any of this possibly last? For a few generations, the answer had been longer than anyone expected. And then, within the span of a single lifetime, the answer changed. The 2 rivers began to dry. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but enough. The rains that fed the northern fields grew thinner, year after year, in a pattern no priest, no omen reader, no careful record keeper in any temple courtyard could explain or predict. Harvests that had once filled Akkad's storerooms season after season began coming in smaller, and then smaller still. A kind of great scarcity settled over the land, the way a fog settles over a river at dawn, quietly, gradually, and then, one morning, it was simply everywhere. Into that thinning harvest came new arrivals from the northern hill country. People the Akkadian scribes called the Gutians, remembered afterward, in the bitter, defeated poetry the survivors composed, as little more than a chaotic, unstoppable force sent to punish a proud empire for its own overreach. A host of people, one ancient lament describes them, who knew no shame. We should be careful, tonight, about taking a defeated empire's poetry as an unbiased history. The losers of any turbulent age rarely describe their conquerors kindly, but something did unsettle Akkad's grip on its own territory in the very years when its harvests could least afford unsettling. Drought and instability, arriving together, are a difficult combination for any throne to survive. For the families still working the fields nearest Akkad, the change would have arrived first as texture, not statistic, the ground harder underfoot after a dry spring. The granary door pulled open to reveal less than the season before, the low murmur of neighbours trying to divide an ever smaller harvest fairly, the same way their Ubaid ancestors once divided the first canal water, generations before there was ever a king to answer to at all. City after city, the one Sargon had once brought under a single throne through decades of determined effort, quietly stopped answering to Akkad at all. Not with a single dramatic ending, no last stand, no burning palace, no single dramatic night historians can point to and say, here, this is where it ended. Just a slow, uneven unravelling, the way a rope frays one strand at a time until, one day, it simply isn't holding anything together anymore. Here's the thing about empires built quickly. They tend to unravel at roughly the same pace they were built, which is to say, faster than anyone inside them expects. Akkad itself, the city Sargon built with such careful, deliberate ambition, its exact location so completely built up and then abandoned that we have still never found it beneath the shifting soil of modern Iraq, simply quietly reached the end of its journey as the world's first empire. The songs written afterward mourned it the way you might mourn a person. Its great gates lie soundless. One lament remembers. Its wide streets where the feasts were once celebrated are strewn with the debris of collapse. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, here in the dark, in whatever room you're lying in tonight. Every empire in this story, and there will be more before we're done, is, underneath all its grandeur, a kind of held breath. Sargon held his for decades, through sheer determination and constant travel between restless cities. His grandson held it a little longer, through gold and ceremony, and a horned crown he was not born wearing. And then, one dry season at a time, the breath simply ran out. That is not a tragedy unique to Akkad. It is the quiet undertone beneath almost everything we will meet tonight. Every splendid thing eventually loosens its grip, the way your own hand, right now, is slowly loosening around whatever thought you were holding on to when this sentence began. But an ending, in the Two Rivers, was almost never simply an ending. After a stretch of confusion, smaller kings, local rulers, a patchwork not unlike the one that had existed generations before Sargon ever picked up a bucket of water, a new centre of gravity began to form, this time around the old familiar city of Ur, the very city where, according to Sumerian legend, kingship itself had first been lowered down from heaven. A dynasty historians now call Ur-3 rose out of that confusion, and for roughly a century, something like order returned to the Two Rivers canals repaired, trade routes reopened, temples rebuilt, records kept once again with the same careful, patient hand that had always defined this place. And it was under this renewed order, under a king named Ur-Nammu, that something happened which would echo far beyond his own reign, far beyond his own dynasty, all the way to the legal systems many of you listening tonight still, quietly, live under. Ur-Nammu had a set of laws carved and copied, distributed to be read aloud in the cities under his rule, rules about property, about marriage, about what a person owed another person when harm had been done between them. It is, as far as anyone has ever found, the oldest surviving written law code in human history, older than the one we're about to meet properly in just a little while. Picture, for a moment, what that must have meant to an ordinary person living under it. Before this, if you had been wronged by someone more powerful than you, if a debt went unpaid, if property was seized unfairly, your only real recourse was whatever mercy that powerful person felt like extending, on whatever day you happened to ask. Ur-Nammu's laws did not erase that imbalance of power. They did something smaller, and in its own quiet way, larger. They wrote a small handful of rules down, in a form everyone could, in theory, ask a scribe to read aloud to them, so that even the powerful had something fixed to answer to, rather than nothing at all. Imagine, for instance, a modest dispute. A farmer whose ox strayed into a neighbour's barley field and trampled a full season's growth before anyone noticed. Under the old unwritten way of doing things, the outcome depended entirely on whose family held more influence in that particular town, that particular year. Under Ur-Nammu's carved rules, the outcome depended, instead, on the rule itself, a fixed answer, worked out once, and applied the same way whether the ox's owner was a poor farmer or a wealthy landholder. It would be centuries yet before anyone thought to call an idea like that justice. But it is, unmistakably, one of that word's very first quiet drafts. Ur-Nammu himself, historians believe, reached the end of his own journey unexpectedly, during a distant campaign that his own dynasty's later chroniclers preferred to describe only vaguely. His laws, though, outlived that quiet, uncomfortable ending by centuries, copied and recopied by student scribes long after anyone still living could have named the king who first ordered them carved. That idea, a rule, carved once, applying afterward to everyone the same way, did not disappear when Ur-Nammu's own dynasty eventually inevitably began to fade. If anything, it was only getting started, because a century after Ur-Nammu's laws were first read aloud in the streets of Ur, a new city, further north, was about to take that same idea and carve it into something the whole world would still remember 5,000 years later. Ur-Nammu's dynasty, like every dynasty in this story so far, eventually reached the end of its own journey too. In the year we today number as 2004 before the Common Era, the city of Ur, the very city Sumerian legend once said kingship had first descended into, from heaven fell to a coalition of outside forces after years of pressure, poor harvests, and a slow draining of the resources that had once made it strong. Picture it, for just a moment, the way a scribe living through it might have. The granary doors standing open and nearly empty, officials writing increasingly desperate letters to a king who could no longer help them, the irrigation canals that had fed this land for 1,000 years, silting up faster than anyone remaining, had the strength to clear them. A lament composed not long afterward mourns the city in language still striking after 4,000 years. Ur is destroyed, one line remembers. Bitter is its lament, a place emptied, almost overnight, of nearly everything that had once filled it with life. The poetry, like the poetry mourning Akkad before it, remembers an ending, but endings, in the two rivers, as we've already seen once tonight, were rarely the last word. Out of that unravelling, much like out of Akkad's before it, a new centre eventually formed. This time, further north still, along a bend in the Euphrates that had been, for centuries, a modest, unremarkable town, a place most of the great cities we've already met tonight would barely have registered as a rival. Its name was Babylon. For its first few generations, Babylon was simply one more city trying to hold its own footing amid the same shifting patchwork that had followed every previous empire's ending. Small kingdoms, local rulers, alliances made and broken along the river, the pattern that seemed to repeat itself, generation after generation whenever a single throne loosened its grip on the two rivers. And then, 6 king reigns into Babylon's own dynasty. A ruler took the throne whose name would end up outlasting nearly everyone else's in this story. His name was Hammurabi, and whatever else he accomplished during a reign that lasted more than 4 decades, the thing that would still matter, 5,000 years later, to a person lying in the dark on the other side of the world, was a tall pillar of polished black stone. When Hammurabi inherited Babylon's throne, the city controlled little more than the land immediately around it, one modest kingdom among several competing for influence along the river. Not yet the name history would eventually attach to the word empire. Over the 4 decades that followed, through alliances as often as through open conflict, he brought city after city under Babylon's authority, reaching influence, eventually, over most of the territory that Sargon's empire had once claimed, nearly 6 centuries earlier, before it too had reached the end of its own journey. Picture it, if you can, a stele carved from stone the colour of a night sky, more than 7 feet tall, standing somewhere a person could walk up and actually read it, or more accurately have it read to them. Since most people in Hammurabi's Babylon, like most people anywhere in this story so far, could not read the cuneiform pressed into it themselves. At the very top, carved in relief, Hammurabi stands respectfully before a seated god, receiving, according to the image, the authority to rule justly directly from divine hands. And beneath that image, carved in careful, patient rows, nearly 300 laws, 282 of them, to be precise, covering property and marriage and debt and the responsibilities that a builder, or a doctor, or a merchant owed to the people they served. Here's the thing about that number. 282 laws sounds, at first, like nothing more than administrative detail, the kind of number that belongs in a footnote, not a bedtime story. But sit with what it actually means for a moment. 282 separate situations, carved once, applying the same way whether you were rich or poor, powerful or powerless, in Babylon or in a small farming town 200 miles downriver. That is Ur-Nammu's small, quiet idea from a century earlier, grown enormously larger and considerably more ambitious. Some of the code's most famous lines can sound, to modern ears, almost shockingly harsh. The phrase, "an eye for an eye," which actually first appears here, carved in black stone. Centuries before, it would echo through later religious texts halfway across the world. But it helps to understand what that phrase was actually replacing. Before laws like this existed, punishment for a wrong done was whatever the injured party's family decided to make it an open door to escalating. Unlimited retaliation, one household against another, spiraling further with each generation. An eye for an eye was not, in its original context, a call for cruelty. It was a ceiling, a limit, a rule that said, in effect, whatever was done to you, the consequence in return may go this far and no further. Extreme, by the standards of the room you're lying in tonight, but a genuine act of restraint by the standards of the world it was carved into. The code covered far more ordinary situations than its most famous lines suggest. If a builder constructed a house that later collapsed, consequences followed the builder, not the family who trusted him. If a canal, poorly maintained, flooded a neighbor's field, the person responsible for its upkeep owed compensation for the lost harvest and echo, if you listen for it, of exactly the same cooperative canal-sharing logic that first brought village families together beside the riverbank, all those centuries ago, long before any king existed to write a single law down. Consider one particular category of rules that rarely makes it into the code's most famous summaries: inheritance. If a man reached the end of his life without clear instructions for how his property should be divided among his children, the code did not leave the outcome to whichever family member argued longest or loudest. It set out, in advance, how shares should be worked out, including provisions for children born to different mothers, a common arrangement in Babylonian households, each entitled to a fair portion rather than whatever the eldest sibling decided to allow them. It is a strange kind of comfort, maybe, sitting here in the dark, to realize that arguments over inheritance, the kind many families still quietly have today, were common enough, 5,000 years ago, that an entire section of stone was devoted to settling them fairly in advance, before anyone had the chance to argue at all. That's the quiet thread worth noticing here, in the dark, as this section draws to its close. Ur-Nammu's laws, and Hammurabi's after them, did not invent the idea of fairness out of nothing. They simply carved into permanent stone something that families beside a river had already been practicing, in miniature, for 2,000 years before either king was born. The belief that an agreement, once made, should hold the same weight no matter who is asking or answering. That same principle, a rule fixed in advance, applying the same way to everyone, whether powerful or ordinary, is, in a very real sense, still the quiet architecture underneath nearly every contract you've ever signed, every rule you agreed to without ever meeting the person who wrote it. Hammurabi did not invent fairness. Almost no one in this story invented anything from nothing. He simply carved, in permanent black stone, a version of an idea that had already been growing quietly beside these two rivers for 2,000 years. You are still, tonight, living under some version of it. Somewhere outside Babylon's walls, meanwhile, life had never stopped moving to its own slower, gentler rhythm, a rhythm we're about to settle into ourselves, for a little while, as we let the empires rest and turn, instead, toward the ordinary people who lived beneath them. As you lie here, perhaps starting to drift, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to hold on to any of the numbers we just carved into stone. Let them go, if you'd like. Let's rest, instead, in something quieter, the part of this story that never got carved into any law code at all, the actual texture of an ordinary day, lived by people who never ruled anything and were never expected to. Picture this. Somewhere in a Babylonian courtyard, or perhaps in an older Sumerian one, it hardly matters which, because this particular scene barely changed for 2,000 years. A woman sits before a standing loom, her fingers moving without needing to look, threading wool dyed the soft ochre of river clay. The air around her smells faintly of raw wool, and underneath that, something warmer, sweeter, drifting over from the courtyard next door barley, gently fermenting in a wide clay vessel, the smell of bread and beer. In this world, almost indistinguishable from each other, because they were, in fact, made from nearly the very same simple mixture of grain and water and patience. Somewhere close by, a low wooden frame creaks softly, rhythmically, as another set of hands works a second loom. A dog, somewhere unseen, shifts and resettles in a strip of afternoon shade. She is not thinking about empires or law codes or which king currently holds the furthest reaching throne along the river. She is thinking, if she is thinking about anything at all beyond the rhythm of her own hands, about how many lengths of cloth this batch of wool will make, and whether her daughter, learning beside her, has finally gotten the tension of the thread right. Here's the thing about a moment like this one. It repeated, almost exactly, for something like 2,000 years, through the rise and fall of every empire we've met tonight so far. Uruk, Akkad, Babylon, all of them rising and falling above a foundation of ordinary work that never once stopped happening underneath them. Nearby, a small child, too young yet to be trusted with the loom, sits close to the warmth of the courtyard oven, listening to two women trade quiet gossip about a neighbour's upcoming wedding, about whether the barley harvest this year would stretch far enough, about nothing terribly important at all, the kind of unhurried, low conversation that fills ordinary lives everywhere, in every era, including, very likely, in whatever room or street exists just outside the window nearest to you right now. A little further along the same courtyard wall, someone else tends a small clay oven built low into the brick, its opening glowing a soft, deep orange in the late afternoon shade. Flatbread dough rests nearby, already shaped, waiting its turn. When it finally goes in, the smell that rises warm, faintly smoky, faintly sweet from the barley itself, will drift out past the courtyard wall and into the narrow street beyond, mixing there with a dozen other identical smells, drifting from a dozen other identical ovens, all along the same street, at almost exactly the same unhurried hour. Beer, in this world, was not a luxury. It was closer to a food, brewed by women in most households as a basic, everyday part of feeding a family. Thick and nourishing, drunk by nearly everyone, including children, in a world where water itself could not always be trusted. There is a comfort, maybe, in imagining how unremarkable most of this would have felt to the people actually living it. No thought of being remembered 5,000 years later. No thought of being anyone's ancestor. Just the ordinary repeating rhythm of thread and grain and fire, the same rhythm, more or less, that fed the temple accountants of Uruk, the water carrier who became an emperor, and the scribes who carved law after law into stone, meant to outlast every king who ordered it. We already said, a little while ago, that ordinary hands like these quietly held up every throne and every law code we've met tonight. Here it is again, in a different shape, so it has a chance to settle in properly, somewhere beneath every king's boastful inscription, beneath every carved law, beneath every collapsed and rebuilt empire. There was always a woman at a loom, a baker at an oven, a farmer walking a familiar row of barley doing, on an entirely unremarkable afternoon, the same quiet work that had already outlasted several empires, and would go on, patiently, to outlast several more. Weavers like her produced far more cloth than her own household could ever use enough. In fact, that woven textiles became one of the two river's most valuable exports, carried out along the very same trade routes that once brought lapis lazuli and obsidian in. Her hands, quietly, without her ever needing to know it, were part of an economy that reached, eventually, hundreds of miles beyond the courtyard she sat in. Her daughter, still learning the tension of the thread, will one day teach this same motion to a daughter of her own, who will teach it to another, on, in a chain of ordinary hands stretching so far forward that one of its last unbroken links quietly, without either of them ever knowing it, is a piece of woven cloth in your own home tonight made differently, by different hands, in a different country, but descended in the same wandering, patient sense as your clock and your alphabet, from exactly this courtyard. Take a slow breath if you'd like, right along with this pause. There's truly nowhere else you need to be right now than exactly here, in this quiet courtyard that doesn't exist anymore, listening to a loom creak and a small oven glow, 4,000 years after the last person who actually lived this moment stopped remembering it themselves. Some of what her hands produced never left the household at all, worn, mended, worn again, until it softened into something closer to family history than clothing. But some of it, folded carefully, would be carried down to the riverbank, loaded onto a low, flat boat, and sent downstream toward a market where it would be traded for things that had never grown anywhere near these two rivers at all. Deep blue stone from mountains few people in this courtyard would ever see with their own eyes, and a strange black volcanic glass, sharp enough to cut a reed clean through, carried by traders whose entire lives were spent moving between one river valley and the next. None of this required a king's decree. It simply required patience, the same patient, repeating work that had shaped this river valley long before any throne existed, and would go on quietly shaping it, long after every throne we've mentioned tonight had crumbled back into the mud it was built from. Because those two stones, the deep blue one and the sharp black one, came from further away than almost anyone in this courtyard could imagine, carried here along roads that connected this quiet valley to a much larger world. Picture this. A small trading caravan has just arrived at the edge of a riverside market, its donkeys still dusty from weeks on the road, their breath rising in soft, tired huffs into the cooling evening air. Somewhere nearby, a fire has already been lit for the night. The safety of it, the low orange flicker, is the first thing the traders look for after a long stretch of open country. The caravan leader kneels beside two small leather pouches, untying them slowly, almost reverently. Inside one, a scatter of deep blue stone, veined faintly with gold, cool and smooth against the fingers. Inside the other, shards of a strange black glass, so sharp along their broken edges that a careful trader learns, quickly, exactly how to hold them without ever touching the edge itself. The deep blue stone is called lapis lazuli, and on this particular evening, it has already travelled nearly beyond calculation, carried on the backs of donkeys and camels, changed hands a dozen times, crossed mountain passes that most of the people trading it will never see, all the way from a single remote valley in what is now northern Afghanistan. The black glass is obsidian, volcanic in origin, carried down from the highlands of Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the north, where it forms naturally when certain volcanic rock cools too quickly to crystallize into anything softer. Here's the thing about a trade route that stretches this far, this early in human history. No single person walked the entire distance from that Afghan valley to this riverside market. Instead, the lapis moved in short, overlapping relays, one trader carrying it 100 miles, handing it to another who carried it the next 100, on and on, valley to valley, market to market, until, months or even years later, it finally reached hands that had never left the two rivers at all. By the time it arrives, a single small bead of lapis lazuli might be worth, in trade value, roughly what a family here would spend an entire season growing. Uruk's temple accountants, careful as ever, recorded these trades the same way they recorded barley and wool weight, quality, quantity, all pressed into damp clay, because a stone this valuable was never simply admired, it was counted. Here's the thing you might recognize. Lying there tonight, the device resting on your nightstand right now was very likely assembled from parts that crossed almost as many hands, almost as many borders, as that single bead of lapis lazuli once did a sliver of metal from one country, a curl of wire from another, glass from a third, none of it questioned, none of it remarkable to you, because you have never had to trace it back the way we're tracing this stone back tonight. The instinct is exactly the same. Only the distance feels shorter now, because we've gotten so good at hiding it. The roads these traders followed were rarely roads in any way you'd recognize. No pavement, no signposts, just a worn path of packed earth, widened gradually by centuries of the same careful feet and the same patient hooves, following the easiest route between one reliable well and the next. A trader learned the roads the way a sailor learns currents, which stretch flooded in spring, which pass grew dangerously cold at night, which market town could be trusted to offer a fair price and a safe fire to sleep beside until morning. None of this moved on a king's command. Long before any Sargon, any Hammurabi, ever issued a single decree about trade, these routes had already been worn into the earth by generations of ordinary traders who simply kept doing what worked, trusting the same market towns, trading with the same distant partners, generation after generation, the same quiet cooperation that once dug the first canals beside these two rivers, now stretched outward, valley by valley, until it reached mountains the earliest villagers could never have imagined existed. And it was never only stone and metal moving along these roads. Ideas moved too, a new way of weaving, a new shape for a pot, a story about a flood that would eventually surface, in one form or another, in nearly every culture these roads ever touched. Trade, it turns out, was never simply about acquiring what you didn't have. It was one of the oldest ways human beings ever discovered of quietly borrowing from each other's imaginations. Picture, once more, that same caravan leader sitting now beside the evening fire, turning one lapis bead slowly between thumb and forefinger, watching how the low firelight catches its faint gold veining. He does not know the name of the mountain it came from. He does not know the name of the person who first pulled it from that mountain. He only knows that it is beautiful and rare, and that tomorrow, if the road stays kind, he will trade it onward to someone even further from where it began. That, more than any single object, is the real shape of trade in the ancient world. Not one long, dramatic journey, but hundreds of small, ordinary handoffs, each one so unremarkable to the person making it that none of them ever thought to write it down. The stone remembers none of this. Only the distance it travelled remains, quietly, in the ground, waiting for someone thousands of years later to dig it up and wonder how on earth it got there, because stone and wool and grain, however far they travelled, still had to move somehow on the backs of donkeys, yes, and on human shoulders, but increasingly as the centuries passed, on something with a far stranger origin than any mountain road, a simple spinning disc that had, until recently, only ever been used to shape a pot. Some roads, over centuries, wore themselves so deep into the landscape that later travellers, walking the very same route 1,000 years afterward, could still feel the shape of every footstep that came before them, a shallow groove in stone, a smooth dip in a mountain pass, evidence of exactly how many feet, hooves and cartwheels had once passed through, all following the same practical logic. The easiest way between two reliable wells is rarely a straight line, but it is almost always the same line, used again and again, until the land itself remembers it. That practical logic, the same route, worn smoother with every passing year, is, in its own quiet way, one more thing you inherited without ever noticing. The road outside your own home tonight almost certainly follows a route someone chose generations ago, for reasons that made sense at the time, reasons most of us will never think to ask about. We rarely question why a road goes where it goes. We simply follow it, the way traders once followed a worn path toward a reliable well, trusting that whoever came before us chose reasonably. By the time our caravan leader finally reaches the riverside market, The deep blue stone and the sharp black glass have both, in their own way, come home set into a temple offering, perhaps, or a merchant's ring, absorbed quietly into a valley they never grew in, carried there entirely by the patient, unglamorous work of ordinary people walking the same roads over and over, for reasons that rarely made it into any king's inscription. None of it required a single decree, a single law, a single king's permission. It required only distance and patience, and enough ordinary trust passed hand to hand across mountains and rivers to make a valley without lapis, and a valley without obsidian, feel, eventually, as though both stones had always belonged there. Everything valuable in this story so far has moved this way quietly, unglamorously, one patient handoff at a time, and soon that same patient handoff would carry something even stranger than stone, an idea shaped first from wet clay, spinning quietly under a potter's hands, about to be tipped, for the very first time, onto its side. That same spinning disc, the one that had, for generations, done nothing more glamorous than shape a bowl, was about to be tipped onto its side and carry something forward for the very first time. The wheel that carried our traders' stones home did not begin as a wheel at all. Long before anyone thought to attach it to a cart, it was simply a flat disc of clay, spinning slowly under a potter's palms. The very same disc we met briefly once already tonight, shaping pots in a quiet workshop near the riverbank. It took, by some estimates, centuries before anyone thought to tip that same idea onto its side and let it roll instead of spin in place. Once it did, everything about distance changed. A cart pulled by a single ox could carry, in one trip, what it might once have taken 4 or 5 people an entire exhausting day to move on their own backs. Roads that had once measured a journey in days of walking now measured it in a fraction of that time. The world, without growing any smaller, suddenly felt within closer reach. Picture it, briefly, one more time before we let it go. An ox cart moving slowly along a packed dirt road at dusk, wooden wheels creaking rhythmically against the ground, a low, warm smell of animal and dust rising in the cooling evening air, a driver walking beside it rather than riding, in no particular hurry, because for the first time in his family's memory, hurry was no longer strictly necessary. Here's the thing about that. Every time you sit in a car, or watch a train slide past, or roll a suitcase across an airport floor, you are relying on the same basic principle a Sumerian potter once discovered almost by accident, that a round shape, turning steadily against the ground, will always move an object further, with less effort than simply carrying it. Nobody had to reinvent that idea after Sumer. It simply never stopped being useful. The wheel was far from the only quiet, unglamorous invention still shaping your life tonight without your permission. Somewhere in these same river valleys, a standard unit of weight was agreed upon, a fixed measure of silver, a fixed measure of grain, so that a trader in one city and a buyer in another could agree, without argument, on exactly how much a transaction was actually worth. Somewhere in these same valleys, 2 people first sat down, pressed their agreement into wet clay, and sealed it with a small carved cylinder rolled across the surface. The earliest ancestor of the contract you may have signed at some point in your own life, quite possibly without ever thinking once about where the habit of writing agreements down actually came from. None of these things demand your attention. A wheel does not ask to be thanked. A standard weight does not ask to be remembered. A written contract does not ask you to trace its origin back 5,000 years before you're willing to trust it. That is, in its own way, the quietest kind of inheritance there is the kind so completely absorbed into ordinary life that it stops looking like an inheritance at all, and starts looking, simply, like the way things have always been. So let's close this thread here, gently, before we let it rest. The wheel, the measured weight, the written agreement, none of them arrived by accident, and none of them arrived because anyone commanded it. They arrived the same way the canals arrived, the same way the first shared temple mound arrived, the same way the earliest trust between 6 families sharing one narrow stretch of river once arrived, because someone, somewhere, quietly needed a better way to solve an ordinary problem, and once they found it, everyone around them simply kept using it. You are, in fact, surrounded by this kind of inheritance right now, in ways almost too ordinary to notice. The blanket resting over you was very likely woven on a loom descended, in spirit if not in exact mechanism, from the very one we sat beside in that quiet courtyard a little while ago. The measured hours ticking somewhere nearby trace back to accountants dividing a harvest fairly. Even the simple fact that you trust the words on this page or the voice reading them to you to mean roughly the same thing they meant when a person first pressed them into clay rests on an agreement about writing that is, itself, 5,000 years old. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of these small, unglamorous clay contracts out of the ground over the last 2 centuries, receipts for sold cattle, agreements over shared canal maintenance, marriage contracts, loan agreements, even complaints filed by one neighbour against another over a boundary wall built slightly too far onto shared land. Almost none of it was written to impress anyone. It was written simply because 2 ordinary people needed a way to remember, later, exactly what they had agreed to earlier, the same small, human need that still sends people, today, reaching for a signature on a printed page. There is something almost peaceful in realizing how little of what holds your life together was built by anyone trying to be remembered. The wheel's inventor left no name. Neither did whoever first agreed that 60 would divide a circle evenly, or whoever first pressed a seal into wet clay to mark a promise as their own. They were not building monuments. They were simply solving what was in front of them, the best way they knew how, one ordinary afternoon at a time, and it turned out to be enough to outlast every empire we've met tonight so far. Tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from, none of that quiet inheritance is asking anything of you either. You don't have to remember any names. You don't have to trace a single wheel, or weight, or written word back to where it began. You only have to notice, if you'd like, just for a moment, how much of what carries you through an ordinary day was carried to you first by people who never once imagined you. And now, gently, let's set all of this quiet, ordinary inheritance down for a moment, and turn back toward the grander, more turbulent part of the story, because empires, unlike wheels and woven cloth, rarely fade quietly. They tend to announce themselves, and the next one waiting for us tonight announced itself louder than almost any before it. Not through the humble spread of tools and measures we've just walked through, but through something colder, more deliberate, a strategy of power meant to be felt from a very great distance indeed. Thank you for staying with me this far into the night through villages and cities and quiet courtyards and roads longer than most of us will ever walk. For a while now, we've been tracing quiet things, inherited things, but not every empire in this story was built quietly, and the one waiting for us next carried its power in an entirely different way. As you lie here, wherever you are, perhaps drifting a little further now than you were an hour ago, that's exactly as it should be. What comes next doesn't ask for your full attention. Let it move past you gently, the way weather moves past a window you're not quite looking out of. Far to the north of Babylon, along a stretch of the Tigris colder and rockier than the gentle floodplain we've spent most of tonight beside, a people called the Assyrians had been quietly building something of their own, a kingdom that would, in time, grow into one of the most powerful and most formidable the ancient world had ever produced. The Assyrians ruled through a strategy that later historians have sometimes called psychological, not because their armies were larger than everyone else's, though at times they were, but because word of what happened to a city that resisted them was allowed, deliberately, to travel faster and further than the army itself. A reputation, carefully cultivated over generations of political upheaval and conflict, could conquer a city before a single soldier ever reached its walls. Fear, used carefully, is its own kind of weapon, one that costs nothing to deploy once it has already been established. Even neighbouring kingdoms who never directly faced an Assyrian army adjusted their own behavior simply based on rumor and reputation alone. It is an uncomfortable kind of cleverness to sit with, here in the dark. We don't know exactly how many of the stories about Assyrian conquest were true in every detail, and how many were exaggerated on purpose, spread as propaganda by the Assyrians themselves to save everyone, including their own soldiers, the turbulence of an actual prolonged conflict. What we do know is that it worked, for a very long time, across a territory larger than almost anything the two rivers had produced before it. At the height of their power, Assyrian kings ruled from a series of increasingly grand capital cities, Nimrud, then Dur-Sharrukin, then finally Nineveh, each one larger, each one more heavily fortified, each one built as though its own scale alone might discourage anyone from ever testing it. Massive stone reliefs lined their palace walls, carved with scenes meant to remind every visitor, in permanent and unmistakable stone, exactly whose territory they were standing in. Somewhere in the back of every visitor's mind, walking those corridors, a quiet question must have formed. How long can any of this possibly last? We've asked that question about every empire so far tonight. We're not quite finished asking it yet. And yet, in the middle of all that carefully cultivated fear, one Assyrian king did something that had almost nothing to do with conquest at all. His name was Ashurbanipal, and somewhere inside his palace at Nineveh, he assembled what may have been the first great library the world had ever known. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, gathered deliberately from every corner of his kingdom, copied, catalogued, and stored with a kind of care that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a very different instinct, the quiet worry, instead, of losing knowledge that had taken thousands of years to accumulate. Among the tablets, Ashurbanipal's scribes copied and preserved were medical texts, mathematical tables descended from the same base, 60 counting we met a while ago tonight, hymns, omens, and, remarkably, one of the oldest surviving copies of the story of Gilgamesh himself, the restless king of Uruk, still searching, tablet after tablet, for a kind of immortality he never quite found in life, and had, by complete accident, already achieved in writing, long before Ashurbanipal's scribes ever thought to copy his story down again. Picture it, for a moment, before the fire ever comes, rows of clay tablets stacked on wooden shelving inside a cool, dim room, the air thick with the dry, mineral smell of sun-baked clay and old dust. A single oil lamp casting long shadows across shelf after shelf of careful cuneiform rows. A scribe moves quietly between them, checking a catalogue tablet against the text stored nearby, making sure nothing has been misplaced. Outside, beyond thick palace walls, a city hums with a kind of confidence that, from the inside, must have felt permanent commerce, ceremony, the ordinary rhythm of an empire that had, by every visible measure, already lasted longer than anyone's living memory could account for. Here's the thing about that library, and it's a strange, quiet kind of grace. When Nineveh itself eventually reached the end of its own journey, and every capital city in this story eventually does, fire swept through the palace, and the roof of the library collapsed inward, burying everything beneath it in ash and broken brick. It should have been the end of everything Ashurbanipal had gathered. Instead, the very heat and collapse that ended the building baked those clay tablets hard, the way a kiln bakes pottery, preserving in destruction what careful hands might never have preserved on their own. Tablets meant to last for a single reign have lasted, instead, nearly 3,000 years. There is something worth sitting with in that, here in the dark. The same ash that marks an ending, in this story, may also be the very thing that let a piece of it survive at all. We'll see that shape again before tonight is over an ending that turns out, quietly, to preserve more than it destroys. And here is the strange, quiet thread reaching all the way from that ash-buried library into whatever room you're lying in tonight. Every hard drive humming faintly under a desk somewhere, every server farm cooling itself in some unlit warehouse halfway across the world, every folder of scanned documents saved carefully against the day the paper might one day fail, all of it descends, in spirit if not in shape, from Ashurbanipal's quiet worry that knowledge patiently gathered by generations before him might, if no one looked after it, simply be forgotten. You are still, tonight, living inside the same instinct. Here's the thing about confidence that size. It rarely announces its own fragility in advance. Every empire we've met tonight, Akkad, Ur, and now this one, felt, from the inside, at its peak. Very much like it might simply continue forever. None of them were wrong to feel powerful. They were only wrong, eventually, about forever. Perhaps you know a version of that feeling yourself, a stretch of life that felt, while you were living it, as though it could not possibly end, until, quietly, in ways you didn't fully notice until much later, it did not with a single dramatic collapse, but with 100 small changes nobody thought, at the time, to write down. Empires are not so different from that. They are simply larger and slower, and their unravelling takes longer for anyone living through it to actually see. For a while, Assyrian control reached further than any single throne along the two rivers had ever reached before deep into what is now Egypt, across much of the eastern Mediterranean coast, north into the mountains, east toward Iran. Administrators, modelled loosely on the same bureaucratic habits first developed generations earlier, in Akkad and Babylon, managed roads, tribute, and correspondence across a territory too vast for any single ruler to personally oversee. Distance, once again, had to be managed not through force alone, but through the same patient administrative habits that had already been quietly perfected, city by city, for 2,000 years. But an empire built this much on carefully managed apprehension carries its own particular fragility. Loyalty maintained through reputation, rather than through genuine shared trust, tends to hold only as long as the reputation itself remains unbroken. Toward the final decades of Assyrian power, a series of succession disputes and internal political upheaval began weakening the very foundation that had once seemed unshakable, cracks appearing quietly in a structure that had spent centuries convincing everyone, including perhaps itself, that it could never crack at all. Distant provinces, sensing that weakness for the first time in generations, began quietly testing how much resistance the centre could still actually enforce. We are not quite ready, tonight, to watch that particular ending unfold that belongs to what comes next, along with an even grander city further south, rebuilding itself for one last, brilliant stretch out of Assyria's fading shadow. For now, simply carry this quiet question forward with you, the way you've carried so many others tonight. What does it look like, exactly, when the most powerful place in the entire world reaches the very last, brightest moment before it begins, slowly to fade, and yet, before those cracks widened into collapse, one final burst of splendor was still to come, one last capital, further south, that would burn brighter, if only for a little while, than almost any city before it. The city was called Babylon, still the very same city we last stood inside during Hammurabi's reign, more than 1,000 years before this. But by the time this next chapter of its story began, almost nothing else about it looked the same. Assyrian power, as we already saw, had finally begun to loosen its grip. Political upheaval in the north, succession disputes at the top, distant provinces sensing weakness for the first time in generations, all of it had, over the course of a single lifetime, thinned what once seemed unshakable, and into that thinning grip, quietly at first, then all at once, an old southern city stepped back into the very centre of the world. A new dynasty rose in Babylon. Historians today call it the Neo-Babylonian period, though the people living through it would not have thought of themselves as anything so tidy. To them, it was simply Babylon returned, and its most famous king, a man named Nebuchadnezzar II, spent decades rebuilding it into something that, by nearly every surviving account, briefly outshone every other city on Earth. Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a wide processional way, paved with limestone slabs polished by years of ceremonial feet, in what may have been, for a short stretch of history, the single most spectacular street in the entire ancient world. On either side, walls rise higher than any wall you have ever stood beside, not made of ordinary mud brick, but faced, deliberately, with glazed tiles the colour of the deepest, coolest blue evening sky, catching the late afternoon light in a way that seems almost to hum. Set into that blue, in bright yellow and pale white relief, are rows of lions striding forward at your shoulder height, one after another, all along the street, 120 of them, by some ancient counts, though the exact number is one of many things this city seems to have kept quietly to itself. The air smells faintly of dust and warm stone. Somewhere further ahead, water moves in a shallow channel, the way water always moved in a Babylonian street, part cooling, part ceremony. And at the far end of that long blue corridor, catching the low sun almost impossibly, rises the gate itself. They called it the Ishtar Gate. It was one of the 8 gates that pierced Babylon's inner walls, and it was, by every surviving account, the most spectacular of them all. A double-arched entrance faced entirely in that same deep blue glazed tile, so densely decorated with lions, bulls, and dragons in yellow relief that later travellers, arriving from distant kingdoms that had never seen anything like it, sometimes stopped their caravans simply to look at it before daring to walk through. You can, remarkably, still see a reconstructed portion of that gate in a museum today. The actual tiles, pulled patiently out of Iraqi soil in the early 20th century, reassembled thousands of miles from the place they once stood. If you could reach out and touch one of those tiles, the surface would still be cool and smooth beneath your fingertips, the same slightly imperfect glaze it had when a Babylonian tilemaker first finished it, more than 2,500 years ago. Rising above the gate and its blue walls, at the very centre of the city, stood a ziggurat called Etemenanki, literally, the foundation of heaven and earth. A 7-tiered temple tower rebuilt and expanded under Nebuchadnezzar into what may have reached nearly 90 meters in height. 90 meters is difficult to hold in the mind as a bare number. Put another way, it stood roughly as tall as a modern 30-story building, standing all alone at the center of a flat river plain, visible, on a clear day, from further away than most modern skyscrapers ever manage in their crowded skylines. Some historians believe this same Etemenanki is the tower dimly remembered, centuries later, in the far more famous story of the Tower of Babel, a story shaped by memory of exactly this kind of impossible, sky-reaching structure, glimpsed by traders passing through from further west, then carried home and slowly turned into a parable. There is even a legend, quietly attached to Neo-Babylonian Babylon, of hanging gardens rising in tiered terraces somewhere inside the palace complex, watered by an unknown mechanism drawing water upward against gravity itself. Whether they truly existed inside Babylon's walls, or whether, as some careful historians now believe, the story actually belongs to a garden at Nineveh, misremembered later under the wrong city's name, remains one of the many small mysteries this city seems reluctant to give up. Either way, the fact that they were remembered at all, thousands of years later, as one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world, tells you something about the scale of the impression Babylon left on anyone who saw it in its brief final peak. Here's the thing about that peak though, even at its brightest, it lasted less than a single lifetime. Nebuchadnezzar himself reached the end of his own long journey. Nearly 43 years on the throne after leaving Babylon, transformed almost beyond recognition, his successors, one after another, held that throne for shorter and shorter stretches. Within just a few decades of his passing, Babylon was ruled by a king named Nabonidus, a scholar, an antiquarian, a man far more interested, by every account we have, in restoring ancient temples and studying older gods than in defending the empire he had inherited. He spent long stretches of his own reign living far from Babylon, in a distant oasis called Tama, leaving the day-to-day business of the capital to his son. The Great Akitu Festival, the annual celebration of Babylon's chief god that had, for centuries, required the king's personal presence, went uncelebrated for years at a time. To many Babylonians, that absence read the same way any long absence of a leader eventually reads to the people under them. Quietly, uncomfortably, as though something had already begun to loosen. This was, in truth, the shape of a splendor already fading not through any single dramatic event, but through the same slow accumulation of small changes that had once ended Akkad and Ur, and Assyria too. Blue tiles do not stay bright forever. Ziggurats, however tall, do not defend themselves. A city built to be remembered still has to be maintained, season by season, hand by hand, and the hands doing that maintaining were quietly beginning to look elsewhere. Somewhere further east, meanwhile, a new kind of power was already taking shape, a rising kingdom under a young ruler whose name the world would eventually remember with almost none of the fear it had once attached to Assyria, and none of the mixed awe it had attached to Babylon. Cyrus, they would call him later, the founder of what we now call the Persian Empire. His armies were, by the standards of the time, disciplined, well-supplied, and remarkably, for the ancient world often welcomed by the cities they approached, because Cyrus had made a habit, unusual for a conqueror, of leaving local temples, local customs, and local peoples largely intact wherever he arrived. That reputation, quiet and patient the way many powerful things in this story have been quiet and patient, was already moving faster than his armies were. By the time Cyrus finally turned his attention southward toward Babylon itself, the question was no longer whether the city could resist him. It was, instead, something quieter and much stranger, whether it would even try. And what happened on the night that question was finally answered, the night Babylon changed hands, almost without a fight, depends, like so many endings in this story, on which surviving account you happen to trust. The story of what happened next the night Babylon changed hands has been told, in one form or another, for 2,500 years. And like so many of the endings we've walked past tonight, it depends almost entirely on which surviving account you happen to trust. The most famous version comes from a Greek historian named Herodotus, writing more than a century after the event itself, in a language spoken thousands of miles from the mud walls of Babylon. He describes in some detail how Cyrus's engineers diverted the Euphrates, the same steady, forgiving river we met at the very beginning of tonight's story, into a low-lying marshland outside the city, temporarily lowering its level enough that Persian soldiers could wade beneath the walls themselves, up along the exposed riverbed and into the sleeping heart of the capital. Whether it happened quite that way, historians still gently disagree. Herodotus loved a good story, and the story of a great city undone by the very river that had once made it possible is, in the end, a very good story. Older cuneiform tablets written closer to the event itself tell it far more simply, with almost none of the dramatic river diversion at all, and with something closer to a quiet handover. What all the surviving accounts do agree on is the shape of the ending itself. In the year we today number as 539 before the Common Era, Babylon changed hands almost without a fight. There was, by every ancient description, almost no prolonged conflict inside the city, almost no widespread destruction, almost none of the turbulent scenes that had marked the endings of Akkad, or Ur, or Nineveh. Cyrus entered Babylon, and Babylon, quietly, opened. Some accounts even describe him being welcomed by parts of the population priests of the neglected chief god of the city in particular, who saw in this new outside ruler someone more likely to restore proper ceremony than the absent scholar king they had just been living under. There is something almost strange, sitting with that, here in the dark. Every empire before this, in this story, ended with lament, with poems composed afterward mourning specific streets, specific gates, specific granary doors standing open and empty. Babylon, at least in its political form, ended with something much closer to a quiet resettling. The blue-tiled walls remained, the Ishtar Gate remained, the Etemenanki still rose above the city's rooftops. Only the throne inside it had, quietly, changed occupants. Here's the thing about that quiet ending. It marked, more than any single dramatic moment we've met tonight, the true closing of an era, the age in which the two rivers themselves had been the center of the world. For nearly 3,000 years, everything worth writing down, everything worth counting, everything worth building high enough to see from a full day's walk away had happened somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The villages here had invented cities, the cities here had invented writing, the scribes here had invented recorded law, the accountants here had invented the 60-based counting, still ticking away, tonight, on the small device beside your bed. And now, for the first time since any of those inventions had first begun, the center of political power had moved, decisively, somewhere else. Persia rose. Later, Alexander of Macedon would sweep through, briefly making Babylon the capital of an even larger empire before, quite young, reaching the end of his own journey inside the city itself. Later still, Greek rule would give way to Parthian rule, and Parthian rule to others, and the mud-brick heart of Babylon would slowly, quietly, be abandoned by the people who once maintained it, as newer cities elsewhere along the two rivers grew large enough to draw the population outward, generation by generation. As you lie here, wherever you happen to be tonight, you don't need to hold on to any of these names, or any of these dates. Let them slide past. The only thing worth carrying gently with you into whatever comes next is the shape of what happened, not the paperwork of it. But something did continue, quietly, long after the political center moved elsewhere, and that something is the last real thread we've been carrying with us all night. The scribes did not disappear, not immediately, not for centuries. Cuneiform, that strange wedge-shaped writing born in a lamplit temple room in Uruk more than 2,500 years earlier, kept being pressed patiently into damp clay long after Babylon had ceased to matter as a political capital. In smaller and smaller temple communities scattered across the two rivers, a handful of dedicated scribes kept copying the old texts, the omens, the mathematical tables, the astronomical records, the hymns to gods whose worshippers were slowly dwindling. They kept copying because that is what scribes had always done. Not to be remembered themselves, not even always because anyone was still reading what they wrote, simply because the habit of carefully copying something forward so that it might survive another generation was, by now, embedded so deeply in the culture of the two rivers that no single political ending could quite dislodge it. For a while, cuneiform coexisted alongside newer scripts arriving from further west, including, eventually, an entirely different way of writing, based not on syllables or picture-derived signs, but on a much smaller collection of shapes representing individual sounds. The alphabet, in one of its earliest surviving forms, had already appeared centuries before quietly along the eastern Mediterranean coast in a form the Phoenicians and their neighbours developed for their own trading purposes. From there, versions of it spread into Greek, into Aramaic, into the ancestors of nearly every alphabet that many of you listening tonight still, without ever quite noticing, use every single day. The idea beneath that alphabet was, at heart, exactly the same idea that had first appeared in that lamplit room in Uruk long ago. A mark could represent a sound, rather than a thing, but the alphabet took that idea one crucial step further. Cuneiform, by the time of Hammurabi, required a scribe to master hundreds of separate signs, a full decade of training before a person could reliably read or write it. An alphabet of 2 or 3 dozen shapes could, in principle, be learned by almost anyone with a few weeks of patient effort. Writing, which had begun as a specialized skill guarded closely by temple professionals, was quietly becoming something ordinary people, one small language community at a time, could learn to do for themselves. And so cuneiform, over the centuries, thinned. Fewer scribes copied it. Fewer temples still supported the long training needed to read it. Younger generations, learning the newer, simpler alphabets instead, no longer bothered to pick up the older signs at all. The way it ended was, remarkably, the same way it had begun, not with any single dramatic moment, but with a slow, patient, almost invisible shift, one dedicated scribe at a time deciding, quietly, that the tradition ended with them, the very last cuneiform tablet we have ever found, the very last time, as far as we can tell, that anyone, anywhere pressed a cut, reed into damp clay in the wedge-shaped script born in Uruk, is dated to somewhere around the year 75 of the Common Era. That's a rough estimate. Scholars gently debate the exact date, and future finds may push it slightly later, but roughly then, which means, remarkably, that the tradition begun by tired temple accountants in Uruk lasted, unbroken, for more than 3,000 years, before finally gently being set aside. If you are lying here, perhaps starting to drift a little further now than you were earlier, that's exactly as it should be. There is nothing here you need to memorize. Just let this next thought pass you, softly, and settle wherever it settles. Picture this. Somewhere in one of those last surviving temple communities, perhaps in a small city along the Euphrates whose name we no longer even recognize, an old scribe sits cross-legged one last time on a woven reed mat in a small mud-brick room lit by a single oil lamp. The air still smells, faintly, of scorched sesame oil and cool river clay, the very same smells that filled that first Uruk lamplit room 3,000 years earlier. His fingers are stained the pale grey-brown of dried clay dust. His shoulders ache a little. Around him, no student sits waiting to learn. His teacher and his teacher's teacher and the entire long line of teachers stretching back beyond memory are gone. He is the last person, anywhere, doing this particular thing in this particular way, and he does not know it. He presses the final wedge into damp clay. He sets the tablet aside to dry. He blows out the oil lamp, and that quiet, unremarkable evening, an evening that would leave no lament behind, no poem, no carved stone marker anywhere in the two rivers, is the true end of a story that had begun 3,000 years earlier, in a room almost exactly like this one. Here's the thing about that, and it may be the quietest, strangest inheritance of them all. Even after the scribes stopped, the ideas they had carried forward did not stop. The alphabets that replaced cuneiform were themselves shaped by contact with cuneiform by the very concept, first proven in that lamplit Uruk room, that a mark could hold a sound. The mathematical astronomy that had accumulated on Babylonian tablets, centuries of careful observation about the movements of planets and stars, was quietly absorbed into Greek astronomy, and from Greek astronomy into Arabic astronomy, and from Arabic astronomy, eventually, into the modern science that still, today, uses the same base, 60 counting, to divide a circle into 360 degrees, an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds. That small device beside your bed, telling you the time in the dark right now. Glance at it, briefly, if you'd like, though there's truly no need to move. Whatever hour it shows you, it is showing you a number system invented by grain accountants beside a river in southern Iraq 5,000 years ago, who never once imagined their careful counting would still be quietly running your evening this deep into the future. There is your clock, finally. It has been with you all night, waiting patiently to be recognized, and the words drifting past your mind right now, in whatever language you happen to think in the alphabet those words are made from, the very possibility that a mark on a page could hold a sound instead of a thing descends through a very long, very patient chain of borrowing and adaptation, from a wedge-shaped mark first pressed into damp clay by a tired apprentice in Uruk, sometime after the sun had gone down and the noise of the market had finally settled into silence. There is your writing. It has been with you all night, too, quietly forming this very sentence as you listen or read. And the whole myth, the one so many of us grew up with that civilization, began somewhere else entirely, somewhere further west, somewhere later, somewhere neater and more familiar. You can, if you'd like, Set that down now, gently. It began here, between two rivers most modern maps barely mention, in villages that never asked to be remembered, in workshops and temple courtyards and lamplit rooms full of tired, ordinary people who almost certainly thought they were just doing paperwork. You are still living in their world. You always were. Not because anyone commanded it, not because it was written into any law code or carved into any stone, simply because ordinary hands, working ordinary problems, one careful evening at a time, ended up building a foundation deep enough that every empire, since every language, every science, every quiet habit of counting and measuring and writing something down so that it might outlast the person who wrote it, has been standing on top of it, without ever quite pausing to look down. The rivers, meanwhile, are still there. The Tigris still runs fast and reckless. The Euphrates still moves slower, calmer, more forgiving, wide and lazy, easy to predict, easy to live beside, exactly as it did on the very first evening. Some tired Ubaid farmer sat down beside it and decided, quietly, not to keep walking. They flow, both of them, still, on and on and on. So take a slow breath now, and let the whole long night we've walked through settle gently around you. So take a slow breath now, if you'd like, and let the whole long night we've walked through settle gently around you. Between two rivers, 5,000 years ago, ordinary people quietly built the world you are lying in tonight. Not in a single dramatic burst, not because any king or god or grand plan commanded it, simply because they needed a way to divide a canal fairly, and a way to remember what was owed, and a way to shape a pot evenly, and a way to make sure the powerful had something fixed to answer to, and every one of those small, ordinary needs, met patiently, one careful evening at a time, ended up being enough. You have been carrying pieces of that quiet inheritance with you all night, without needing to be told. The hour glowing softly on the device beside your bed, that hour was measured out for the first time by grain accountants working in a temple courtyard. The words drifting through your mind right now, in whatever language you happen to dream in the very possibility that words could be written down at all, was proven, once, by a tired apprentice pressing wedges into damp clay by lamplight. The blanket resting over you was woven, in spirit, on a loom descended from the one we sat beside in that hushed courtyard, hours ago. The road running just outside whatever room you are lying in almost certainly follows a route someone chose generations back, for reasons that made sense to them, and that you have never had to ask about the same patient logic that first wore paths into the mountains between one reliable well and the next. There is a comfort, maybe, in realizing how little of what quietly holds an ordinary life together was ever built by anyone trying to be remembered. Nobody carved their name into an hour. Nobody signed the very first wheel. Nobody claimed authorship of the strange, tender idea that a promise could be written down, then read aloud years later, and still hold the same weight it held on the day it was made. Those inventions arrived, and stayed, and slowly settled into the ordinary shape of a life you did not have to build yourself. None of it asks anything of you tonight. It never did. It has simply been carrying you along, quietly, the way rivers carry things they never notice they are carrying at all. And the two rivers themselves, the ones we began with, on that first warm mud dawn, with reeds rustling and clay pressed between fingers, are still, at this very moment, flowing. Somewhere far from wherever you happen to be tonight, the Tigris is still moving fast, still restless, still a little reckless. The Euphrates is still moving slowly, calmly, forgiving. They are both, right now, on their long, patient journey toward the sea, the same journey they were on before Uruk, before Sargon, before Hammurabi, before Nebuchadnezzar's blue tiles, before the last scribe blew out his oil lamp for the final time. Everything we have talked about tonight was built beside them, and, one by one, gently returned to the earth beside them. But the rivers themselves have simply kept going. They will still be going, in their own quiet way, long after tonight is over. And so, In a much smaller, much softer sense, will you? There is nowhere else you need to be right now. Nothing more you need to remember. If your eyes are already closed, let them stay closed. If they are almost closed, let them finish the journey they have already begun. Wherever you are tonight, a small apartment in Tokyo, a quiet room in Sacramento, a truck stop somewhere outside Kansas City, you are not, tonight, quite alone. Somewhere, in whatever room you are lying in, 5,000 years of ordinary hands are with you still, and the rivers still are flowing. Rest well. Good night.